What is up, YouTube? You're about to watch a conversation that I had with Eric Schmitt. Eric is the head SNC for the Memphis Grizzlies, a team in the NBA in the US. And he had some questions about low intensity training, about Zone 2, about whether or not it has its place for elite basketball players. We had a great conversation around all those topics and many more. So here you go, without any further ado, my exchange with Eric.
Following your journey for some time and kind of listening to the guests that you've had for a while. So it's just about time I reach out to you and, chop it up on some stuff that I think we're both pretty interested in. You probably have gone way down, a deeper rabbit hole than I have on this stuff. So more here to pick your brain,
Cool.
but should be good.
Yeah. Anything I can do to help? Like you said, we both took that course from Evan Pike on a few years ago, and yeah, I've had him on the podcast a few times. I'm looking forward to having him back on soon when they do the public launch for the device that they've been working on for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
That's going to be interesting, since I haven't had him on for about a year, but I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, man, anything I can help you with today, I'm more than happy to try. At least I'll try. I can't guarantee I'll have all the answers, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, no problem.
Wherever you want to start, man.
Well, hey, I guess the reason I reached out to you to begin with is just, again, listening to some of the guests that you've had on and just some of the things that you've been into. Recently, I listened to the In and Go podcast that you had on, and Zone 2 is a hot topic right now, I guess, or just low intensity training. And so I'm work with the Memphis Grizzlies organization here, and we've definitely utilized some of the low intensity training methodologies, and but maybe you're in a unique, I guess it's a unique population, obviously, with our game density and just the sport that we play, as opposed to most of the people that I've listened to chat about the benefits of Zone 2, the volume, frequency, how you measure it, all that good stuff, sort of live in a different space, which is the endurance sport world. So I know you work with some mixed modal athletes. I think you work with a lot of CrossFit athletes. I actually don't know exactly who you work with, so maybe we could start there. But
yeah,
just trying to maybe work through some of the differences in maybe what sort of applications we're using with this type of training, how we're measuring it, if we're not doing some of this longer physiological monitor, physiological testing, things like that. So I guess place to start is maybe you could tell me a little bit about sort of what your clientele is, and kind of what you guys are monitoring, measuring, and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably a good place to start. So I have a team sport background. I played soccer growing up. I played some rugby in my late teens, early 20s. And fast forward through me starting coaching, personal training, I started doing some physical prep, some SNC with my local rugby club when I came back to Switzerland after spending 7 years up in Vancouver, Canada. And so I started applying a lot of things that I learned from Kierwan and Flat and everybody on this platform through Strength Coach Network. Learned a lot. So implemented a lot of speed work with the guys, a lot of interval tempo training, I guess, not in the sense of endurance training tempo, but more Charlie Francis type stuff. Yeah. And those were very foreign concepts, at least at the time, for the team that I was working with. But it was very, I was lucky that I had played in the club before. So I knew, like, the president of the club I used to play with when I was younger. So I had a bit more bandwidth than maybe coming into a club where nobody knew who you are and what you were doing. So they let me apply all those things. It worked really well. I thought I had a good handle on conditioning. I'd read Joel Jamieson's book. And then I watched Evan Picon's course, like you. And that blew my brains out. And I felt like I had to relearn everything I thought I knew. So I guess the methods didn't change much, but the underlying physiology and the understanding of what's going on in the body has evolved a lot. And especially in the last few years, that stuff moves at the speed of the technology that we had to measure it. So as technology improves, we get a better understanding of what's going on under the hood. Obviously, a lot of people have been able to do that for decades without any of those measurements. So it's it's not necessary, but I'm just curious and I like to understand those things. So dove down into those concepts of conditioning, understanding the underlying physiology behind it, and invariably was drawn to endurance sports and learning from what's going on in that space, because those are pretty old sports and they've kind of, we know now what works, we know how to best train, and we know what we have to focus on. So I've learned a lot through obviously all those folks, athletes that I've, been able to talk to, listen to a lot of podcasts myself, recorded a bunch myself as well. And really my podcast has been my platform for continuing education, just going to ask the experts the questions that I have, which has been really helpful for myself. And so more recently, what I've been doing, following all this research into exercise physiology and human physiology as it connects to conditioning, I've been doing a lot of physiological testing. So in that, I work with endurance sport athletes, cyclists, runners, triathletes. I work with a lot of CrossFitters right now. That's, I'd say, the main space that I evolve in. And I already had a foot in that space, and I was able to work pretty early on with some athletes in France. And since then, I would say that my community has grown around this a lot. So currently I work individually with Claudia Gluck, who's one of the best females in France, currently sitting 22nd in the world after the second week of the CrossFit Open, which is pretty exciting. I work with some guys who are on, it's a sailing category called Sail GP. So it's kind of the Formula 2 of sailing. So they have foils, so they fly, the boats fly, they do 100 kilometers an hour on the water, and those guys grind. So it's like arm cycling.
Yeah.
And they push more watts with their arms than most people do with their legs. Let's just say that.
Jesus.
So
those guys got to be jacked.
Yeah, they're pretty jacked. Shout out to Julien and Jeremy, two guys of the Swiss team that I work with. Awesome. Those are the athletes that I work with one-on-one, and otherwise I have a big pool of people that I work with, not necessarily individually, but that I've been kind of implementing and following some of the programs that I have around just general conditioning, really for CrossFit. I think you were talking about Zone 2 being very much in vogue today. I think it's Sure. It's always a pendulum swing with trends, right? For a while it was HIIT training. We're kind of going back to the basics of low intensity training and endurance. So it's nothing new, nothing invented. It's always been here. We've just kind of disregarded it for a while, and now we're coming back to it and maybe seeing the importance of it. I don't know if it's COVID and people had time and that's what they did and they saw the benefits and now people talk about it.
Yeah, sure.
But anyway, it seems to work quite a bit. And especially in let's say younger sports like CrossFit, MMA, I've working with some fighters as well. All those mixed modal sports that have a high skill component to them, so very time consuming. You have to learn all these skills. You have to develop all those abilities, and low intensity training being deemed as non-useful in those cases because they're high intensity sports. So why would I do low intensity? Plus I don't have time, so I'm just going to forget about it. I think that's kind of what happened. And now they're realizing that if you want to train 20 hours a week, well, you need to be endurant. Maybe your competition is not, 5 hours, 10 hours like an Ironman, but if you're training 20 hours a week, every week of the year, and you don't have the capacity to recover, to assimilate the training, then at some point it's not gonna go. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. Obviously there's many more things that are important besides low intensity training, but I feel like that's definitely when we talk about endurance and developing general qualities, it has to be part of the conversation, in my opinion, no matter what the sport is. So I guess that gives a bit of context to our conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's cool to hear you talk through sort of kind of your journey and then now who you're working with, because again, I just feel like we're kind of on the same wavelength in terms of just like our journeys. Because the Joel Jameson, days of, I guess, whenever his book came out, and that whole thing blew up, and that introduced the cardiac output training, which is, Selyanov's low intensity training, and he gave those cardiac zones, and then, I dove into that work, and I'm doing I'm doing long duration cardio all of a sudden. And then, high intensity continuous training was another protocol that he recommended that was kind of similar along the same, I guess, lines when you're talking about some of the adaptation. So dove into that. For whatever reason, maybe that faded out. And then now the zone 2 stuff is back in. And
Right.
I think it was, for me, it was the Inigo podcast with Peter Attia like a few years ago that just kind of blew my mind. And then you tap into the Moxie course that, Evan did and kind of get a whole new frame of like, the bioenergetics and what's kind of really going on. And then now, I've been using Moxie for a while too, just on myself, messing around with it. So yeah, really cool to hear. I guess where to start, because if we're going to stick on zone 2, which I kind of want to for a little bit and get your perspective on, how are you defining it? Because I've heard people define zone 2 training differently. Maybe start there.
That's the first hurdle to get over, is getting to a common ground when it comes to defining it. And you can ask 5 different people, even in endurance sports, or 5 different physiologists, and you'll probably get at least 3 different definitions of zone 2.
Sure.
So I think, for at least what I take away from all the exchanges that I've had, is that what matters, especially when we talk about endurance sports, what matters to me is when we have a change in internal state from one state to the next. So the way I look at this, in exercise physiology, we have what's called exercise intensity domains. Yep. And so those discriminate between different internal states. So we have the moderate domain, which is manifested by low lactate levels, if we're measuring that. So they're going to be close to baseline level, which you would have at a rest. Then if you were to measure VO2 and the kinetics of VO2, so how VO2 evolves at the onset of exercise, you would quickly reach a steady state and it would stay nice and flat. So that's the moderate intensity domain.
Okay.
Then you have the heavy intensity domain, in which you would see an elevated levels of blood lactate if you were to measure that. Elevated, but it stays stable over time. And if you were to look at the VO2 kinetics, it would go up, and then before it plateaus, it would keep creeping up for a little bit. It's called the slow component of VO2, and then it would stabilize itself. So you kind of have that extra little bump after the first onset, after the kind of first phase. And so that's kind of 2 different ways to measure it. And then you have the severe intensity domain, which is commonly named, HIIT training, VO2 max, zone 5. That's kind of what all those terms kind of come back together. And what happens there is you have an exponential rise in blood lactate, which means you cannot stabilize your lactate levels anymore. And if you were to look at VO2, well, what's going to happen? It's going to creep up, and then it's going to keep creeping up until you reach your VO2 peak or your VO2 max. And shortly after, you're probably going to fail the task. So I think I like to think in those 3 domains, because it kind of just breaks up the intensity spectrum nicely. And then at the transition between those domains, we have thresholds. So that's an eternal debate in exercise physiology. Again, there's as many thresholds as you might want to define, and there's lots of methods to measure them. But essentially what I'm looking for when I'm doing the testing is I'm looking for a change in internal state, whether it's with the VO2, whether it's with the Moxie, whether it's with the lactate, so that we can kind of parse out those different internal states, and then we can plan training in those different intensities based on that. So that's kind of the physiological framework underneath the zones. And then when we talk about zone 2, there's multiple models of zones. So that gets confusing too. Some people talk about a three zone model. So what they mean is moderate, heavy, and severe domain. So they superimpose 3 zones over those intensity domains. So they kind of match up the zones to the physiology, right? And they don't break it up any further. Then you can talk about a 5-zone model. So now what happens is your 5th zone is going to be in the severe domain. So above the 2nd threshold, where you don't have that equilibrium anymore, you lose that steady state, right? And you trend towards failure pretty quickly. Then you have zone 4, which is usually called threshold, if you talk about anybody in endurance circles. So that's kind of straddling heavy and severe domain. It's kind of in between. If we talk about percentages, it might be 90 to 105% of the 2nd threshold that we measured, ideally. Then you have zone 3, which is kind of the rest of that heavy intensity domain. So you call that tempo as well in endurance circles. So it goes kind of from the 1st threshold up to the bottom of zone 4. And then that's where it gets tricky. And that's why my lead up was so long to answering what is zone 2 and how do you measure it. When we talk about zone 2, some people will tell you that it sits below the first threshold. Okay. So when we measure that first inflection in lactate, for example, some people place it below that point. This is kind of how I operate at this point. Some people will place zone 2 as straddling that first inflection point, and some people will actually put it right above it. So depending on how you decide to put, on where you decide to put it, then you might kind of plan differently, right? If we take the basic idea that in endurance sports you want the vast majority of your volume, let's take an easy 80%, right, of your training sessions and volume at low intensities. That's what we want. We want it below the first threshold because we have an internal steady state at the muscular level or at the cellular level. There's no increase in stress hormones, no increase in blood lactate. You can readily oxidize fat as a substrate. You develop mitochondrial capacity, you develop capillary density, vasodilator capacity. You have all those benefits to the heart, obviously, and to the cardiac muscle itself. So it's a very non-stressful stimulus. Now, for those who put zone 2 right above the first threshold, they're not going to do a ton of work there. They're going to do a bit of work there, but they're mostly going to work in zone 1. So again, it maybe seems a little bit complicated because nobody wants to agree on what it means. So I'm trying to just kind of be in the middle there and pull it all together. So if it is complicated, I'm sorry, but I'm doing the best that I can. So that's a long way of saying I like to look at the top of zone 2 as the first inflection in lactate above baseline. So that's how I would measure it.
Gotcha.
And so I would then use that to plan training for my athletes. And again, the first threshold, lactate, for example, there's I think I did an article on that recently. I wrote an article on that recently looking at the different interpretation methods of a lactate curve. And I think that there must be at least 6 or 7 different ways or methods to determine that first threshold. So again, just layers of complexity all over the place. But I use something pretty simple. I look at the baseline lactate. So let's say you're at, I don't know, 0.5 millimoles at rest. You might actually be a little bit higher at rest, and then it kind of drops down, and then it stays, and then it starts going up. So if I take the baseline, I look at when the lactate goes up by 0.5 millimoles. It's an arbitrary value, but that's the best that I've found. And that's kind of my cutoff. And I'm like, okay, once we go above this, we lose that steady state at the muscular level. Now we go to a steady state at the systemic level. So the muscles themselves, the cells themselves can't maintain that rate of work anymore without having that extra byproduct, which is lactate, which is not a bad thing. It's just the byproduct of glycolysis. And now it can't kind of recycle all of it. So it's going to just offset it to the bloodstream so that other muscles can come and help. Maybe it can go to the liver, it could go to the brain, it could go to the heart, it could go to many different places. So that's how I define zone 2. And then when I do a test, I'll measure multiple things at once, but I'll also measure obviously heart rate. And so now I can look at what heart rate corresponds to that first inflection in lactate. And that allows me to then set individual zones based on heart rate. So what I think we should not do is take a fixed percentage of a max heart rate as our top of zone 2, right? What's common is you take your estimated maximal heart rate, so 220 minus your age. And just for those who have used this or still use this, the margin of error is plus minus 15 beats for that math. So you might as well throw it out. It's just don't use that. And then the issue is we superimpose the percentage on that. So 70%, for example, in all the people that I've measured, and I've probably done upwards of 100 lactate tests in the last year and a bit. The range goes from 55% of heart rate max to 80% of heart rate max. So there's a huge difference from person to person. So that's why it's tricky to just say, take that percentage and apply it to everybody. Because for some person, it might be spot on. For others, it might be too high. For others, it might be too low. So again, I like to look at what's going on at the physiological level and then base my prescription in, if it's watts on a bike, if it's kilometers per hour and minutes per kilometer in running speed, and then also have the matching heart rate to go with that output. And then if I don't have that, if I can't measure the internal parameters, I actually go all the way, I swing all the way to perception and working with RPE and just going by feel. Because it's either you measure the physiology or you just listen to yourself. I feel like everything in the middle, all the math that we can apply in estimations, is just going to be suboptimal. So I kind of operate at the ends of the spectrum here.
Okay. Well, man, that was awesome. I appreciate
Hope
that.
It was clear enough.
No, it is clear. I do like the conceptually, I like the thresholds, and when I think about the thresholds, I don't measure lactate, but if I was, then I'm usually thinking of like 2 and 4 millimoles ish, for those thresholds. But I don't do any invasive like lactate testing, so, and I haven't.
One thing I would say about the 2 and 4, it's something that probably applies to certain populations, but for most athletes that are not long course endurance athletes, those values don't mean anything. They're arbitrary fixed numbers that are actually not discouraged to be used at this point in time. Simply because, I'll give you an example. My first threshold is at 1 millimole. So if I have my baseline at 0.5 and I do plus 0.5, that's 1. So for somebody who has a baseline at 2, I've seen that, where it doesn't go any lower than that, and then you do plus 0.5, then it's 2.5, right? So there's already a 1.5 millimole difference there. And then on the second threshold, what you might see for a long course triathlon athlete, for example, you might see values of 4 millimole or something pretty low. For myself, I have a background in rugby. I did some indoor rowing. I'm pretty powerful in terms of, if we look at I like to conceptually think of the powerful to endurance. So kind of dragster to tractor kind of spectrum. I'm definitely more on the high power side. So if I were to sprint, I can put out some pretty good numbers, and my lactate levels would get pretty high. If you were to take somebody with, who's got a much smaller build, not a lot of muscle mass, really doesn't have that kind of turbo aspect to them, and is really just a diesel, can go all day, but cannot really push any power. Then you would actually see very low lactate levels, even with a maximal effort. And so for me, my second threshold is closer to 7 millimoles. So using 4 would not make sense at all, right?
Yeah. Well, that's great to know. That's great anecdote to know too, because again, I just haven't measured this, so I'm just sort of going off of some of the information that I've collected from, and then just putting a framework in my head around sort of these thresholds and maybe what parameters might guide you, to where those thresholds end up being. But as with everything, it's probably a massive spectrum based on the type of disposition of the athlete that we're dealing with, and maybe what sport they're playing, and sort of what they're built for, I guess. But do you do different variations of this of physiological threshold testing, based, like, say you did one on a bike versus on running, right? With the same athlete, are you seeing different? Well, first of all, have you done that, and do you see like a much different profile based on the mode of exercise?
You do. That's a really good question, and it's something that's really important to consider, in my opinion. And a lot of people think that, I can do a test on a bike and then I can just use all my heart rates for my running and all that stuff. We have to consider the impact of the modality and the position of the body in space when it comes to those things. So obviously when you're running, you're upright, you're fighting gravity, you're using a lot of muscle mass, you have a very plyometric movement, so to speak. And so that's going to have impose a certain demand on the system and on the heart. So your heart rate is actually going to be pretty high in comparison to other modalities, right? Your heart rates when you're running is going to be higher than when you're cycling, for example. And that's not because you're pushing harder in running than you are in cycling and that you should work harder on your cycling. It's just that your heart just doesn't beat the same in different positions. So, and that the extreme example is you take a swimmer and then you take a runner. Already in terms of gravity, you're not fighting gravity the same, right? It's like taking your heart rate when you're sitting down or standing up. It's not the same. So there's again the muscle mass that is recruited for the movement, which is going to be different according to each modality. And again, the kind of the kinetics of the muscle recruitment and how or the nature of the muscular contractions. If you compare cycling, which is very cyclical and there's no impact, right? So it's very fluid, let's say. Whereas in running, you have an impact every time you put your foot down. And
Right.
from a muscle tension standpoint, that has an impact as well. And the heart's going to have to work just a little bit harder to kind of get over that occlusion. If we talk in terms that you probably know from Evan's course.
Sure.
So looking at when blood flow is slightly occluded because of a compression from a mechanical compression due to the contraction itself. So yeah, we cannot actually transfer zones or heart rates from one modality to the other, which is unfortunate because it would make our life easier. But for example, for a triathlete, you ideally want to have 3 tests, right? One in swimming, one in cycling, one in running. And so I have done tests on the same person in different modalities, and you essentially just have to treat them like different. You have to treat them in different as different sports, so to speak. And so if I work with, for example, Claudia that I work with, we do a lot of physiological development on the bike itself because there's zero technique involved. It's super easy to collect some miles on there. If you compare that to the rower, which is which can be pretty irritating if you spend long hours on the rower all the time. And with the demands of CrossFit as they are, I don't necessarily want her to spend 5 hours on a rower every week. We know that low back injuries, broken ribs, stuff like that happen to elite rowers. I mean, not often, but it's just common injuries simply due to the position and the constraints of the discipline itself. So I tend to go with low scale, kind of high benefit modalities, and the bike is the best that I've found across the board, no matter what the sport is. Running, I mean, your guys are going to be fine running because that's what they do day in and day out. But take a CrossFitter who doesn't run a lot; they're usually pretty heavy from a muscle mass standpoint. And if they start to go running 3 days a week out of starting from zero, they're probably going to get shin splints. They're probably going to, have some kind of issue simply due to the load, and their lower leg is not accustomed to running. It's just not what they do in the gym a lot. So that I obviously use as well, but you have to progress it accordingly, and you have to make sure that you do all that lower leg strengthening, and you do your power speed drills, and you do all the basics. So yeah, the bike is really my favorite modality for that reason, because of its accessibility. But yeah, you would see different lactate values, heart rate values, whether you do it on a rower, a bike, or running, or else.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I figured, I mean, my assumption is that you're definitely going to see that. I've seen that with myself. I think the thing that I'm interested in here too, and I have maybe a little bit of an assumption here, but when you have like a mixed sport athlete, like a CrossFit athlete who has many different demands that they're going to run into, and you're starting to say, look at a training week and distribute some of this lower threshold work, and you said you've done physiological threshold testing on multiple different modalities. How are you, because I'm biased to say that, the bike is probably the easiest place to sort of get people into this zone as effectively as possible. The easiest way, there's the least amount of skill. And again, you can really isolate things and
no impact, all that stuff,
all that stuff. Right. So, I understand that's the, probably the easiest place to do this particular type of work. That being said, the further we get away from specificity of the sport, then, potentially some of these adaptations aren't going to manifest in the way that we would like. So I guess when I think about a training week and then distributing the modalities of the same work, how are you distributing those with, say, your CrossFit athlete? Are you doing, say, an hour on the rower, as one session, and then two cycling sessions and then one running session or something like that? Or do you see value in doing that? Or do you say, I'm just going to then, because cycling is maybe the easiest place to do this particular work and build volume, that's good enough for me, and then I'll look for, more of the specific work to drive, I guess, connect the dots, if you will, of some of the specificity of transfer and whatnot. So I guess my question is, how are you distributing that work? And maybe a training is a good framework to work from.
Yeah, I guess I heard 2 questions in there, so I'll try to answer each one. One about the general to specific. I like it. And I think
bunch of mumbling and then a couple questions, I'm sure.
It was all clear, man, loud and clear. So the first one, the general to specific, and that's something I had to wrestle with early on when I was kind of trying to establish the best compromise of a protocol for my testing, because there's many different protocols in physiological testing, many different ways you can approach it. How long, what's the duration of each step? How much of a jump do you do from one step to the next? Do you leave rest in between or not, et cetera, et cetera? You can go all day. And so essentially at the end, what you have to come to is the best compromise for you and what you're trying to collect as data. And there's never a perfect protocol. There's just the best compromise for what you're trying to achieve. And one of the weaknesses that I saw in my approach initially working with CrossFitters was exactly what you just said, which is it's not specific to their sport, right? Because they have to do so many different movements in many different combinations. How do you actually test for that? And now I've come to the point where I see my non-specific test on the bike, for example, as a strength in the sense that they're already doing so much specific work to their sport day in and day out, and they've kind of forgotten about general physical preparation. The GPP is gone, right? If you look at the CrossFit pyramid, it's nutrition, metabolic conditioning, gymnastics, weightlifting and throwing, and then sport at the very top. And one thing that happened specifically in CrossFit is that first there was a philosophy, a training methodology aimed at getting you, functioning better as a human. And the idea, and if you read the original kind of manuals of Greg Glassman and the initiation of CrossFit itself as a framework, he says, like, you train in the gym so that you can go and play sports. You develop your fitness through CrossFit, and then you go apply it in different disciplines outside of the gym. One thing that happened in competitive CrossFit specifically is that when CrossFit went from, or when there was that kind of fork in the road, and CrossFit went from just being a training methodology to being that and also a competitive sport, which are now two very separate things. It's not advertised as such. You think it's the same thing, but it's not. Using CrossFit to train for health and being a competitive CrossFitter, you might as well be doing a different sport, right?
For sure.
When that split happened, they took that metabolic conditioning that's almost at the base of the pyramid, just above nutrition, and they put it at the top, because for them, metabolic conditioning equals Metcon equals a really hard CrossFit test, 2159 of thrusters and calories on the row or something like that. And they forgot to fill in the gap that is now at the bottom of that pyramid that was supposed to be GPP, right? CrossFit was supposed to be GPP for whatever sport you went to play. But the day that they took CrossFit and made it a sport, GPP disappeared. It's all specific now. And so what I see now is that the work that I get people to do on the bike, in running and other modalities as well, but again, very heavily emphasized on the bike to begin with, and on running in the second phase, is general work that they're not doing anymore. And general work is not specific, and that's why it's interesting, because the qualities that you developed in general phases will transfer invariably to the specifics that you're going to train after. And the way that I like to frame it is that low intensity training on the bike, for example, and I say low intensity, but I far from only use low intensity, right? People work really hard and really easy on the bike, but that general conditioning, that general work will allow you to then train more and train better in your sport. That's kind of the idea. It's, let's actually grow the base of the pyramid, and it doesn't need to look like your sport. It doesn't need to feel like your sport. But if you can do more work, if you can recover from more volume, from more intensity, that is going to pay off in the medium to long term. And the way that I see it, and from the testing that I've done and the results that I've seen and heard from people just implementing this work, regardless of what sport they're practicing, I think people just lack work capacity in general. And so doing that easy work, it doesn't really matter how you do it, but we need to do more of that easy stuff to then have the infrastructure, have the ability, have the capacity to layer on the intensity and the volume of specifics that we need to get better at our sports. So that was the first part, the general to specific. And then when it comes to planning that over a week of training, if I take Claudia for example, so she usually trains twice a day. once in the morning, and that's going to be centered mostly around the work that I program for her. And it's going to be a big part of it on the bike. There's going to be rowing, skiing, and running. Those are going to be the main ones. She goes swimming once a week as well. And then in the afternoon, she's going to go do her CrossFit training. So that, I say CrossFit, but she's going to do weightlifting, gymnastics, mixed modal, strength work. She's going to do everything that's not related directly to monostructural conditioning, let's say. She's going to do in the afternoon. So right now, and that's another topic we can probably get into later, but right now, this week actually is her biggest week of this training cycle, even though she's competing in the open right now. I mean, for somebody like Claudia, doing one workout that's going to be 15 minutes, even if she goes all out, it's really not that traumatic. So even though she's technically competing this week, it's not like she's doing a 3-day competition with 9 workouts in total. So we actually want her in the best shape for quarterfinals, which are in a couple of weeks. So right now she's still in a pretty heavy phase of training, and she's doing a total of 10 hours of all the ergs combined. So there's going to be again a big part of cycling, and there's some rowing, and usually we'll row twice a week, ski twice a week, run once or twice a week, and then the rest of the volume is done on the bike. And depending on what phase we're in and what we want to emphasize, the hard sessions, they're usually going to be 1 or 2 hard sessions on those modalities per week, not more. Mostly 1, and then when we push a little bit, there's going to be 2. At the beginning, those were mostly on the bike because we were still building her technical competency on the rower and the ski erg. In CrossFit specifically, the way that I see skiing and rowing are as technical modalities. We have to treat those like we treat weightlifting. So we have to be very, very good in our technique and our movement and our efficiency before we can layer on volume and intensity. Plus, again, I don't want her doing, 4 really hard sessions on the rower per week, because it's probably going to compromise her CrossFit to some level. And I don't want that. I want it to be complementary. So we'll do the work on the rowing, on the skiing and the running. And that's kind of the I'd say the important part, quote unquote, of the workout, of the session in the morning. But then depending on the volume that I want to apply that week, I'll just make the session longer and make her continue on the bike. So for example, she might do 30 or 40 minutes on the rower. That might be hard or not. It depends on the day. And then straight after, she'll sit on the bike or she'll go out on her bike for an hour and a half. And so what I get out of this is a 2-hour session. So now we start to build on that other parameter of endurance that is quite that's kind of coming to the forefront in endurance sports right now, is the parameter of durability. Is be able, because if you take cyclists, for example, it doesn't matter how many watts you can put out over 5 minutes at the beginning of a stage in the Tour de France. You have to be able to be the best over the last 10 kilometers of a 5-hour race. And so what they're finding now is that there's actually a lot of highly trained people, maybe not elite, but highly trained people, can put out the same watts as the pros if you just give them a 5-minute or a 10-minute test. But can they replicate that after 4 or 5 hours of cycling? Most of them can't. And that's why the best are the best. It's that durability parameter. And one thing that I'm finding recently is that on that, there's really no shortcut for duration. And so we're kind of pushing the envelope with Claudia a little bit now. I don't think 10 hours is the ceiling. 10 hours is just the work that I give her. She's doing 6 to 10 hours of other stuff on the side. So she's already training 16 to 20 hours on the big weeks. I think we can probably push that to 25 in total over time. Obviously, it's not going to be a quick jump, but same as, in triathlon, you don't become the best in triathlon over a year. It's going to take 5 to 7 to 10 years to accumulate the training load to get to the volumes that allow you to be the best. If you look at the Norwegians right now, and I was lucky enough to talk to Olav, their coach, on the podcast, they train on average year-round 30 hours per week. Big weeks are 40 hours per week. And to the point where he doesn't even quantify training in hours anymore. He has to think in calories, because now his limiting factor is how much can they actually absorb to assimilate the training. And so for me, that was a big eye opener and really made me kind of think outside the boundaries or arbitrary boundaries that we have on our frameworks about sports, and especially CrossFit, which is again pretty young and very challenging and demanding from an intensity standpoint. But if those guys are doing that much work, why are we only training 10 hours a week? Can we do more? And what will it bring? And then obviously, when you want to layer on volume, you just can't do more intensity. So one of the ways to put it in is the low intensity stuff. So going back to the training distribution, this week I think she's got probably four sessions that are going to be 2 hours in duration. And so now we're also starting to think about and talk about, and I actually had a call with Marie, her nutritionist today, talking about intra-session nutrition, right? So how do you eat during a 2 hour session, a 3 hour session, to make sure you get enough fuel to actually be good at the end of your ride, of your session? How do you do this to stay fresh for your next session in the day? So, and those are all, again, things that I learned from the endurance sports and try to bring into CrossFit and integrate in the best way possible. But so again, going back to kind of close on your question, I start with the technical stuff, and then I make the session longer with the bike to match the volume that I want for the week. This is kind of the simplest way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for even the history lesson on CrossFit there too, because that's stuff that I'm not involved in that sport at all, but but I was, that's really fascinating. And that's such the thing I always think about with working in basketball is like, that's so much volume of training that our guys are not hitting those types of numbers in terms of, like, if I'm thinking of hours per week of training. And I think one of the unique things, especially, is the density of the competitions in professional basketball, where the density, is 3 to 4 games per week. We're currently playing, like we played last night, we're playing tonight. Back-to-backs are very common. And so, like you said, I think one of the key components of just being at an elite level is training volume. You see it in different sports. The more volume that athletes can accumulate, the better that they seem to perform, whether that's, Bulgarians in the weightlifting, or if that's endurance, athletes. So it's just, so finding ways to incorporate, more training volume that could support the specificity, even if it is a different, physiological underpinning or bioenergetic profile. That's sort of where my frame of mind comes in implementing this type of work within this sport. But one of the things that is interesting is that I believe that they're getting a fair amount of this type of intensity in some of their skill sessions, and I don't know if that's common. Now, I do need to monitor this a little bit, which is why I want to get into NIRS in a minute here for maybe looking at some of this stuff. But I don't know if that's common in other sports where I've heard, I don't know if that's common in CrossFit, if there are skill sessions where you're already, the sport is exercise, if you will, or it's utilizing, training for the specificity aspects of the sport. So anyway, I do believe that there's a fair amount of this work being done, which is why I'm so interested on, I do have this dose response in my mind of, like, how much work can we accumulate here? But I also want to consider how much work is being done there. And if we can consider, like, some of these the specificity of these skill sessions may have more transfer again to the sport. How much work should I be supplementing with very general work of cycling, or, uphill treadmill walking, or even some of the stuff that we think about with, like, multi-directional movements with, like, low intensity sled pulls. I'm thinking like West Side, GPP type work. So to find a little question in there, I guess, is, are you able to monitor this threshold zone with NIRS devices? And if so, what is the parameters that you're utilizing to kind of ensure that you aren't tapping into, say, those, beyond, say, threshold 1 with maybe can you look at that and say, I can do whatever, pick the modality that you want, and I can monitor using NIRS and ensure that I'm not tapping into those higher lactate zones that would, again, we can kind of use synonymously with just more fatiguing work that they're probably going to have to recover from. So
Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
maybe are you able to monitor this stuff with the NIRS devices?
Yes, that's the short answer.
Cool.
The slightly longer answer is that there's one thing to consider that is not on the box of the Moxie when you get it, is that one thing that's going to impact how the signal looks and how the trends look on the graph when you pull it up either on your app or afterwards through the raw data, is that depending on how deep the signal, the light goes into the muscle, you're going to get a different response and a different profile. So, and that's one thing I had to wrestle with for a long time at the beginning with my testing, is that depending on who I tested, I didn't have the same trends at all. And we were starting from very easy, we were going to very hard, but the way that the trends evolved over that course and those changes in intensity was completely different.
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing to consider, is that depending on how deep the light goes in the muscle, and that's going to be impacted primarily by adipose tissue thickness,
Sure.
right? Then you're going to have a different curve and a different response. So to make it very simple, and there's a video on my channel on that I did with my colleague Jem Arnold, who's he's actually a specialist in NIRS devices, and I think he's probably publishing some research on this right now. And he did a bunch of testing on cyclists. He also measured skin fold thickness, and which is a good proxy for adipose tissue thickness. And he was able to kind of show the link between what trends you get with the Moxie over the intensity spectrum and how deep the signal goes. And so to make it simple, if you have somebody who's very lean, so not a lot of adipose tissue, the light's going to go a little bit deeper in the muscle. And if we think back to those three intensity domains, moderate, heavy, severe, what you're usually going to see in such an individual is a flat down, flat trend, which means that you're going to have a kind of a steady state on the higher numbers. Higher numbers might be anywhere from 40 to 70%. If you look at the SMO2 scale from 0 to 100. In the heavy intensity domain, you're going to have kind of a downwards trend. Sure. And then when you hit severe, now it's kind of flat again at the bottom. Okay. Yeah. So you kind of get that flat down, flat over those three intensity domains. For someone who's not as lean, more adipose tissue, signal doesn't go as deep. It seems like the way that oxygen delivery and utilization functions inside the muscle changes depending on the depth at which you find yourself. Sure. And so what you see closer to the skin with those measurements is more of an up, flat, down, or upwards, flat, downwards kind of trend. So Jem named those kind of the parabolic response and the linear response. Linear was the first one I described, and parabolic was the second one. And again, if you just look up Jem Arnold, Gem Arnold on my channel, you'll find the video, and it's quite clear with the graphic. So that's the first thing to note. I'm sure you guys are all pretty lean, but that's the first thing. Depending on who you're going to be looking at, you might see something different. It doesn't mean that they're different. It just means that you're measuring at a different point. So that's the first thing to consider with NIRS. Now,
can I pause you real quick and just ask a question from there? Yeah. So with these NIRS devices, is the penetration depth 1 to 2.5 centimeters? Is that what that's kind of what I've heard. Is that accurate?
That sounds about right off the top of my head, but I haven't looked at those numbers in a while, so I don't have them exactly. But no, it might be less than that. It might
less than that. Okay.
I don't want to say anything wrong. I honestly don't know. I would refer back to the Moxie website. They have a good manual and they have those numbers expressly cited. So I don't want to say anything that's wrong there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I've noticed when I've done this work that depending on where I put it, if I put it on my calves or if I put it on my quad, a VL versus versus gastroc, then I definitely get different readings, and I'm trying to figure out if those readings come from, and I'm talking about SMO2 values.
Yeah.
Is that more to do with the penetration depth and, and maybe giving me a different part of the actual muscle that those trends don't necessarily line up, or is that because of the specific work that we're doing? So I've been messing around with trying to do different inclines and looking at my calves versus my my VLs if I'm doing walking for, and changing the incline and seeing what those SMO2 values are doing in different parts of my body there. But just wondering if you've kind of thought about that, because like I guess I'm considering for certain work, could you be doing a different zone, depending on the muscle in the body based on the activity, or is this more of a global thing that it doesn't necessarily matter so long as you're seeing those same sort of oxygenating or plateauing trends when you're doing this type of work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for me, the concept of zones starts breaking down when we get out of cyclical motion.
Yeah,
So once we leave cycling, once we leave continuous running, it becomes harder and harder to use those concepts. I think they're good frameworks to use. And going back to what we said earlier, thresholds, they're wrong, but they're useful. That's kind
sure.
of how I like
Yep.
to frame it. But for example, the idea of threshold 2, so that kind of work rate you can sustain for a while. It's hard, but you can keep going, keep going, keep going. And when you pass above this, now you're in the red, and now you really feel the difference, and you feel like it's not going to last very long. I think those are interesting general concepts because they help you with pacing, they help you with feeling what's going on inside the body. But as soon as you go to acyclical work or something that's going to be broken up a lot, you lose, I think, the ability to really impose that model on the activity. And one thing that I would say, back to something you mentioned previously, the skill work that is low intensity in nature,
Yeah.
it is movement. One thing though that is different from, say, cycling, and again, I am biased to cycling because in my opinion it's the best way to train that at this point in time for most people.
Yeah.
The difference is that you're going to have a step, you're going to have a stronger contraction, you're not going to have a continuous flow of blood all the time in the same way. And I think that's one of the upsides of the cycling motion, is that you get that continuous flow of blood. And my understanding at this point is that this continuous flow of blood is what will trigger some of those adaptations. If we think about capillary density, for example, so the capillaries are the interface between your circulation and your muscle fibers. So there's those kind of tiny little tubes that surround your muscle fibers and allow oxygen, amongst other metabolites and things, to pass from the blood into the muscle. Think of it as the exchange. The way I like to simplify this is, think of the taxi or the cab spot in the airport where they go and
Yep.
drop people off. So if you only have 4 parking spots for the cabs, you can only offload, say there's 4 people per cab, 4 people per minute per cab. That's 16 people per minute. They can offload at the airport with that, with that, with that structure. Now, if we double that, now we can offload twice as many people per unit of time at the airport. It's the same thing with capillaries. If you have more of them, you can pass more oxygen to the muscle per unit of time. And that's likely going to result in you being able to sustain a higher work rate for less cost. So that's kind of one of it's not the name of the game, but it's very much part of those central. They're peripheral, but they're central at the same time, because again, it's that interface between the systemic circulation and the local muscle itself. But trying to increase that is one of the goals of this type of low intensity training. And the way I like to think about the adaptations, and it probably doesn't happen like that, but I find it interesting conceptually to think about it like that. Imagine you have a hose that's pouring out water. You're in your garden, you drop it to the floor, it's still pouring water. And imagine you have a little slope, right? What you're going to see over time is that water is going to dig little beds to go through. And in the end, it's got your gardens over a few days, it might start looking a little bit like the Amazon if you take a picture of it from space, right? So we have those kind of arms going out, and that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to apply continuous flow of blood so that we make more capillaries, so that we can get more oxygen through to the muscle per unit of time.
Right.
And so I think that, and I'm not 100% sure on that, but it makes sense to me that continuous cyclical activities would be better suited for those adaptations than
Yeah.
something that's going to be very choppy in nature. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah. And that's, I go back and forth as to like what those mechanisms are,
Mm,
my own head about, because of, because of all the things that you're talking about. And I know that from what people, from the things that I've read, the cyclical work is the name of the game. And sometimes I wonder, is that because those are the populations who do this work the most and measure and monitor these things the most, or is that actually the best way to achieve these adaptations? And then what
mm,
are the things that impede that? And a lot of
mm,
times I'm thinking about a threshold duration to actually get some of this specific protein synthesis to actually lay down these adaptations,
mm,
being one thing. The other thing that could interfere is the catecholamine responses, and that may be altering things. Like lactate is a great signal there that might be going up or down depending on how choppy this type of work is. So
mm,
I go back and forth about just what's maybe the best way to accumulate this type of work, and is some of this, again, what I would consider just this low intensity specific work. It has to be doing something, right? Something
mm.
that is maybe helping to build some of this underlying GPP. But again, I'm just trying to think of, well, how much do we need to supplement beyond that? Because that's the $1 million question. I don't know, no one will have a great answer for that one. Just, it's probably one I would have to seek on my own, but I'm just trying to consider a volume threshold of general work
Yeah.
within this population that would at least give us some way to get some benefit from this. And then I guess kind of maybe a question for you, and seeing where you're at with this, is going off of your car analogy. I'm thinking about maybe finding a way to quantify some of the value of this type of work. If we're doing, say we're doing bike cycling, and we're breaking it into, let's just say, 30-minute bouts, and we're using NIRS to monitor this work, and we're looking at the oxygenation trends and the THB trends and the heart
Mm,
rate, and you're seeing the SMO2 and the THB values and the heart rate values sort of be able to kind of be steady. Maybe heart rate creeps a bit during this work, but for the most part, SMO2 is going to be steady, and
mm,
THB might be going up a little bit. And if I'm thinking about, again, that car analogy, if we monitor this over time, say we did 90 minutes per week for 6 months or something,
mm,
if you're seeing a larger quantity of SMO2 doing the same type of work at, so let's just call it the same exact wattage or intensity there, um, and you're seeing larger quantities of the THB signal, so you're assuming that is a proxy for that blood flow. Is that one way that you could see an ability to quantify a improvement in
mm,
this particular type of work? And I have follow-ups on that. I guess one thing is, it maybe is part of the selling job of this type of work for this population,
mm.
because realistically this is so foreign. It's a very foreign thing, and I'm maybe looking for ways that I'm able to better quantify some of this improvement without the threshold testing. So I'm thinking of
Yeah.
within this actual work. So
Yeah, those are all. There's a few questions there, and I'll try to get them all in order because they were all very, very good. The first one is, and I'll dodge your SMO2 question because I think there's a slightly easier way to quantify this.
okay,
One thing that you said about the heart rate staying steady, that is one way to not guarantee, but have high confidence that you are training at the right intensity. If someone's able to sit on the bike and ride for an hour, and between minute 10 and minute 60, there's no upward drift in heart rate, they're
yeah,
likely at low intensity. And this is going to be a good intensity for them for that kind of work.
okay,
And again, from one person to the next, that might change tremendously, right?
yeah,
Um, Based on their background, based on their current abilities, all those things.
mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing to consider. Nice and steady heart rate over time is going to be good indication that we're in a good spot. The second one is perception. So like I said before, I like to give a 2 or 3 out of 10 for this kind of work. So it means you could hold a conversation easily, right? So if there's two of your athletes sitting on bikes next to each other, they should be able to have a full-fledged conversation and not be, not be out of breath, full form sentences. They should be able to get off the bike at the end and feel better than they did when they started. So no heaviness in the legs, no tingling in the legs. That's usually a good indication that lactate starts creeping up. Having measured that quite a bit, and that's actually a parameter that I use a lot in my testing is the RPE. So I measure lactate, I measure VO2, I measure muscle oximetry, I measure heart rate, but then I'm also asking for general RPE, so the overall feeling of the effort. I'm asking for leg RPE, and I'm asking for respiratory RPE. So I'm actually dissociating into three. So I have the overall view. What are they feeling right now for that intensity? But I also want to know how their legs compare to their breathing, because that might give me some information on how they're feeling and what needs to be focused on most. If somebody, for example, somebody's RPE on the breathing is always one step ahead of the rest, that might tell me that there's some work to do on their respiratory system. So that's one way that I'll determine, hey, maybe you can benefit from doing some focused work on that. I think the RP is great. I think the steady heart rate is great. One way that I'm using to quantify this when I'm not working with someone one-on-one and they don't have access to lactate or other testing devices, and I actually use that in my training programs. They do the testing that I get them to do to estimate their zones. They're suboptimal estimations, but it's the best that we have in that context. And then they're going to do 45 minutes or an hour at a given intensity that I give them based on their test results. And I'm going to get them to measure their average heart rate over the session. And then I'm going to get them to repeat this exact same session 8 or 12 weeks later, whatever program they do. And the rationale behind that is, and there's a really good presentation on YouTube on that. And I forget what it's called, but it talks about essentially circulation and development of the capillaries and vasodilation and all those things that happen. I would have to dig it up, but if you remind me via WhatsApp after, I can dig it up and find it. One thing that was super interesting in that presentation is that they were able, through artificial means, as in not exercise, to increase blood flow to different areas of the body. And what they saw is an increase in capillary density without an increase in mitochondrial density, because usually those two go together, right? If you do more physical activity and you say, let's say you do that low intensity training, you're going to develop your mitochondrial density and your capillary density kind of together. But these people weren't doing any physical activity. They just had more blood flow going through, and that increased their capillary density alone, right?
Were they doing sauna, or what were they doing to do that?
No, it was through some medical intervention or pharmacological intervention. I forget exactly what it was.
Okay.
But the interesting thing is that then they measured the total blood flow to the area for a given work rate. So say these people were cycling at 120 watts at the beginning, and they were quantifying how much blood they needed to supply that amount of work, or to sustain that amount of work. And then they did the same test after they did the intervention and increased their capillary density. And what's super interesting is that blood flow actually went down, because since their exchange surface, the capillaries went up, they didn't need as much blood to do the same work.
Oh, I see.
Right. And so my rationale for doing that before and after test in those programs with the exact same power output and measuring heart rate from start to finish is that if we have an improvement in either capillary density, but it could also be cardiac, right? And we can't parse that out without very expensive equipment.
Yeah, right.
If I have a lower average heart rate for the same amount of work done, then chances are something improved under the hood. Whether the left ventricle got bigger and is able to pump more blood per beat, so heart rate goes down for a given output, or I would have to say, if capillary density went up, meaning that for the same amount of work we need less blood to be supplied, then heart rate would go down.
Yeah.
And so that's one way that I quantify it. And I've seen Jules, that I tested on Monday, came back. He's a CrossFitter as well, and he did over 8 weeks. I think he was doing 3 to 4 bike sessions per week, and he went from 125 beats per minute at 160 watts to 110 beats per minute at 160 watts for an hour. So exact same intensity, 15 beats lower. And obviously that's kind of the initial gains. So we're not going to see a 15 beat drop every 8 weeks moving forward. But I think it's one way to quantify that. That's pretty evident. And one question that you didn't ask, but I kind of heard it before, was what's the minimum amount of this work that we want to be doing to see an improvement? And what I like to say for people that don't do any of it, and obviously for non-professional athletes, and I had to treat with a lot of amateur or recreational CrossFit athletes, for example, they don't have a ton of time to dedicate to training. So what I usually say is try to get 2 hours in per week, even if you have to break this up. And the easiest way to do that is to do 20 or 30 minutes pre and or post session. So whenever you go into the gym, instead of sitting around with your buddies and talking, sit on a bike and then talk there. And just by getting those extra 20 minutes of warm up at the beginning, or 20 minutes of or 30 minutes of cool down afterwards, they're already able to accumulate a little bit of volume. And I've seen positive impacts from just 2 or 3 hours per week in about 8 to 12 weeks is usually the time that it takes for people to really feel the difference. If somebody was really pushing the intensity too much for their capacity, I've had people feel a difference within 3 to 4 weeks. But I would probably say, and that's also the feedback that I got from them, that's probably more from a nervous system standpoint, because going back to what we said earlier, this low intensity training is parasympathetic dominant, right? Because we don't have an elevation in lactate. And if we look at, you mentioned catecholamines before, so one of the hormones of stress, it actually goes up in the same fashion as lactate does. So if we say that lactate stays low, then stress hormones stay low as well. And what that's going to do is just balance out somebody who would be very far on the sympathetic side, very stressed because of the high intensity nature of their activities and their lack of recovery. It's actually going to aid their recovery from that high intensity and just give them the ability to come out of that sympathetic dominant state, if we want to call it that. So I think that's something that we might see even earlier than these physiological adaptations, which will take time because most of them are structural adaptations, right? So there's also other ones. There's increase in blood volume, plasma volume, those kind of things. But again, without very expensive equipment, that's super hard to quantify. But I think the nervous adaptations might not be the right term, but just changes, right? The changes in the balance of their autonomic nervous system. That's probably going to manifest first for people that are really kind of overworked and under recovered. And then those, longer tail adaptations take at least 8 to 12 weeks to manifest themselves. But I think that average heart rate over an easy hour session might be a good place to start. And again, if you can do dedicated sessions throughout the week, then just put your guys on a bike after every session for 20 minutes, and then over 2 months, see how they feel and see what their heart rate says. And I don't know if you guys track HRV and recovery metrics like that. That's also something that I've seen go up. Actually, Jules, that was here on Monday, we looked at his Garmin data, and a lot more peaks and troughs in his energy 2 or 3 months ago. And the last month has been really steady, as in recovering really well every single day, going back up to baseline and being able to just, and that's, I'd say a symptom that I see a lot in CrossFitters is you get to Friday and you're fried, right? You just done. You just can't actually assimilate the amount of work that you impose to yourself throughout the whole week. And one thing that I hear from people incorporating this kind of work for a certain amount of time is, hey, now I get to Friday and I'm still ready to go. I'm recovered. I can really assimilate that volume better. So those are all markers that you can probably look for in your athletes, especially those that maybe are always on the edge of being too tired, that don't recover well. Those are probably those that will benefit the most from this work. And that might be the entry to getting buy-in and then being able to extend that to the rest of the group, right? And that's also a challenge, I guess, in CrossFit gyms, right? Because they have this culture of high intensity for a lot of them. And obviously every gym is run differently. So I don't want to impose a blanket statement on all of them, but it's hard to go from, hey, you came in here to do really hard stuff, to, hey, now you need to learn to sit on a bike for an hour, because that's also part of training. And if you want to go to 2 trainings a day, if you want to go, to the next level, you have to be able to recover better. And volume is going to be one of the ways to get there. And I think the buy-in is the hardest part. So finding 3 to 5 people that are maybe inclined to benefit from that kind of work, or who are just open to trying, right? Because it's a bit of extra work, but it's really not hard at all. It's not going to impact the quality of their training. It's actually going to have a positive impact on their sleep, on their recovery, on their ability to go hard. And so we think of it as, oh, but it's more volume, so it's going to be harder to recover. It's rarely the case. Obviously, if you go from 0 hours per week to 10 hours per week in a split second, it's going to be problematic. So we have to apply progressive overload. And if somebody starts from 0, then I'll usually say, do a couple hours per week for 2 or 3 months, see how you feel. Okay, you're starting to feel the benefits. Now you can maybe find another hour in your week. Now do 3 hours for the following 3 or 6 months. And what's interesting is that I don't think we found the ceiling of this kind of work yet.
Yeah.
And if you listen to pro cyclists, they'll tell you that their VO2 max hasn't changed in 5 or 10 years, right? They've been pro cyclists for a decade or two, and those things don't move. Once you reach your full potential, that's not moving anymore. And their threshold hasn't moved in 5 years either. But their durability, their ability to, replicate high intensity efforts and tolerate training volume and intensity, that seems to keep going up over a whole career. And again, I don't know if they've actually found the upper limit to that. So I really think that by even doing 2 or 3 hours a week, it sounds like a lot. And obviously, if that's the hours that you have to train per week period, that is a lot, because that's your training volume currently. But for people training multiple hours a week already, it's a small investment, and we're really just scratching the surface with that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the good things about the environment I'm in is the frequency lever, so we can pull frequency levers. That's probably one of the easiest things for us to do, because when we're in season specifically, we're working almost, every single day throughout the entire season, with sporadic little off days that we get here. But so it does allow us to pull that lever. And that's what I've tried to do to leverage this particular work, and looking at just an accumulation of time. And yeah, I always think most things are probably, there is a dose response to all these things, whatever type of exercise we're talking about, and I'm trying to maybe at least just figure out within a session what that minimal dose could possibly be. Obviously, it's sort of just like, hey, a little bit of something is probably better than nothing. But
yeah, I'd say 20. I'd say 20 minutes.
That's what I figured. Yeah. Okay. Because that's what I figured too, because it's like, you see, it takes 5 to 6 minutes sometimes to just get this to stabilize, get you to stabilize in that zone. So I'm saying, okay, 15 minutes within that zone, if you're doing a 20-minute session, is probably a decent little volume. So,
and obviously, if you talk to endurance coaches, they'll tell you it's not enough. You need to do minimum 40 minutes to an hour. And I totally understand that point of view. And I took that point of view at the beginning as well. But then again, in the interest of selling the stuff and to the athletes, so that they actually do and getting the buy-in, and in the interest of logistics, because maybe people don't have a limited training hours to assign to that during the week, then I kind of broke it down and said, all right, if you can do the hour session, break it down into 3 times 20 and place that whenever you can, before a session, after a session, both. I don't care. Just do the minutes through the week, and let's see what comes out of it. And I found that alone seems to have a good benefit, a good added benefit. And I think obviously once you can go to longer sessions, like we talked about durability before, so it's probably something to consider down the road. But to begin with, I would say, 20 minutes post session as a cool down, or pre warm up. If it's really cold, for example, it's a good way to just get the system going before you get into your specific warm up. That's probably where I would start, and then really give 2 or 3 months to see the adaptations occur, especially if you're starting with those shorter time frames. But even from a nervous recovery standpoint, I feel like you get out of an intense session or even a game, you want to get all those markers back down to baseline as quickly as possible to recover quickly, to be ready to for the next game, right? You guys have a day to do it, and you look at the Tour de France, the guys finish 6 hours of cycling at insane wattages. What do? They don't just go and sit down, they go and cycle on the roller for half an hour, right? Because obviously they finished at really high intensity, so they want to get all this back down. And it's not like, oh no, we already did 6 hours, that's too much, or that's a lot, we have to recover for tomorrow. It's no, let's get the system back down a little bit quicker by doing that low intensity stuff, and then we can start recovering faster. It's kind of a kickstart to the recovery. That's kind of how I like to see it. Whether it's and there's a counter argument to that. I think it's worth pointing out. So there's the idea that active recovery is better than passive recovery. If we want to see, for example, lactate go down faster, we can actually measure that quite easily. But certain there's a counter argument that I've heard that I find interesting. That is, yeah, but if you leave the lactate in circulation, then it goes to your liver and you turn it back into glucose and glycogen. So it's like, well, which one do you want? Do you want to turn that back in, but then leave those higher levels of lactate and potentially of stress levels higher for longer? Or do we want to get those back down as quickly as possible? And in the counter argument, at least as I understand it, the one of the things that is put forward is, yeah, but then it's going to take more energy, right? Because you're burning more lactate instead of just restoring it. My argument would be just eat a freaking banana. You'll be fine.
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
Sorry. I was like trying to ignore it, see if it would go away. The lady would go away, but okay. I think they were trying to clean the room. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I heard it brings back into light again, talk about things that have gone in vogue and out of vogue, like a cool down. I think about that for our population. It would be such a foreign thing to maybe to sell that, and not sell, but I mean to implement that type of protocol in a post game situation. Do you think there's value in that for a population like basketball? Like, is this something that you see after a game? They go in the locker room, they have their team meeting breakdown. Within 10 minutes of a game, you can get guys onto a bike and doing some of this low threshold work to facilitate and maybe expedite some of that?
It would be interesting. I don't know if I have a clear answer. I would say if that's the best time for you to implement it, then yes. If it would fit better after a training session, an intense training session, depends how many of those you have during the week when you're playing a lot. Yeah. But I feel like before and or after high intensity efforts, both physical and emotional, I find that that's probably one of the best places to put it. Cool. I had the head coach of the Swiss sprints on the podcast a while back, and they actually use, with their 100, 200, 400 meter sprinters, they use low intensity either before a high intensity sprinting day to essentially just bring down the nervous system again and allow them to be fully ready and recovered to go all out. Yeah. Or the other way around, after the fact, to bring them back down from that. So I think you can really you can use it at both ends. You could use it as a warm up, or even as a kind of it's not an actual word. It just came up in my mind, a neural taper, so to speak.
Sure.
If you see what I mean. Or after the fact. And I probably think that after the fact would be the best place to put it. But again, if from a cultural standpoint and a logistical standpoint, it's something that's very foreign and that wouldn't be welcome, then maybe I'd be happy to compromise in implementing this work in a less optimal way or time, just to get the buy-in and then be able to put it in the right places, right? Again, going back to, I'd rather you start with not 2 times 60 minutes, but 6 times 20 minutes, and just break it up into your week however you want, because I just want you to do the stuff for 2 months, feel the benefits, and then ask me, oh, okay, now I understand. Now I'm going to do more because I understand the benefits of it. So I think honestly, whatever you can do to get them to try and implement it consistently over time and give the time to see the repercussions. And again, especially for people that have a hard time recovering, have a hard time sleeping, feel very tired at the end of a week, or don't tolerate the volume of intensity very well, those are going to be the subjects or the athletes that are probably going to respond the best to this work in the first place. It doesn't mean that those who kind of fly over everybody and are fine all the time, I think they could probably benefit from it as well. I think that, and I would actually maybe switch from the performance side to the health side. I think that from a metabolic health standpoint, and that's something that we've kind of lost a lot in our society today, and probably in part due to our lack of movement in general. We're made to walk a lot. We're made to move all day. And obviously you guys move a lot and train a lot. And that's a thing, but just that easy movement, continuous movement of either walking or now we cycle. This is something that we probably don't do enough of. And that is part of who we are as a species. And going back to health, I would say that if the performance argument doesn't stick, then maybe the health argument will, because everything that you're built, like your mitochondria, your muscle, that's the only stuff that's alive within you, right? And we saw, especially over the last 3 years, that if metabolically you're not healthy, you're more prone to all kinds of stuff. And one of the way to develop that mitochondria is to simple cycle more, or just do more of that low intensity training. It might just be walking for a lot of people, right? If we talk about just basic health stuff. And there's a reason why those cyclists have such high mitochondrial density. It's and obviously when we look at the Tour de France, and my argument is not that if you're able to do the Tour de France, then you're the healthiest man alive, because those guys push themselves to the point where we're beyond that. But that's I guess the same in all performance realms.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it's important. It's interesting from both ends, and maybe if one argument doesn't go through, the other one might be interesting.
Yeah. Awesome. I mean, that's great. I got about 20 minutes to catch a bus here. So I probably got to pack up my apartment or my hotel room here. But, we'll definitely have to connect further. I really, really appreciate, this call and taking the time to just chop it up on all this stuff. I got some follow-up questions for you, and definitely will reach out about some of these things that you mentioned.
Let's do another one of those. That was fun.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to. So, really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet, man. It was great to connect, and I liked your questions. And I think it's also interesting for me to try and apply or transfer those principles and those ideas to other sports, other disciplines, areas where it's maybe not used at all, or underdeveloped, or even something sometimes frowned upon, depending on who you talk to. But I think it's interesting to play with those ideas. And again, if it can help people feel better, recover better, play better at their sport, then what's the harm?
Exactly. Yeah. And get healthier, like you mentioned. So
exactly.
Definitely. Well, yeah, we'll have to chop it up a little more on, I do want to get in nerd out on some of the mechanisms, because that's something I know you spend a lot of time on, really understanding some of the deeper physiology. So we'll have to do that too.
That sounds good.
But appreciate it again.
Thanks, Eric.